The war that could have united North America history books call it the War of 1812, but buried beneath the muskets and uniforms was something far bigger, a blueprint for a united North America. For a brief moment, the US, Britain, and Canada stood on the edge of becoming one continent under one system. Treaties, secret deals, and near invasions all pointed toward a single outcome that never came. The war didn't just decide borders, it decided what North America would never become. In 1812, North America was one decision away from becoming one country. What people call the War of 1812 wasn't some polite border scuffle, it was Washington's full-blown plan to absorb Canada. President James Madison, in a private message to Congress in June 1812, called it a campaign to liberate British North America, but everyone knew what that meant: invasion. The plan was bold and overconfident. The US believed Canadians would welcome them with open arms, that the colonies north of the border were secretly waiting for liberation. Instead, they got musket fire. Canadian militias fought back with a vengeance, and their indigenous allies didn't just defend, they dominated. The war began with American troops marching north, certain of victory, but within months, that confidence evaporated. The Americans underestimated two things: how fiercely the locals would fight, and how quickly the indigenous confederations could unite. Upper and Lower Canada were fragile, still forming their identities, but the invasion gave them purpose. The result was resistance that stunned Washington. By early 1813, the US had burned York, modern-day Toronto, but they couldn't hold it. The further they pushed, the more stubborn the defense became. Historians later said that if the war had dragged on just 6 more months, Canada might have collapsed entirely, and the continent could have ended up under one flag. But that didn't happen, because Britain, though distracted by Napoleon, sent a message that empire doesn't die quietly. Britain was already bleeding in Europe, fighting Napoleon across the continent when America chose that moment to attack. The US thought it was smart timing. It wasn't. Britain still had the world's best trained soldiers and the most disciplined navy, and now it had allies who knew the land better than anyone: Tecumseh's Confederacy. The Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, was no ordinary commander. He was a visionary who had spent years trying to unite indigenous nations from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi into a single defensive wall. When the US declared war, Tecumseh saw it as a last stand for his people. Under British command, his warriors became the deciding factor in early battles. They terrified American troops unaccustomed to fighting on that kind of terrain. The first invasion, led by General William Hull, collapsed in humiliation at Detroit. Hull surrendered without a fight, terrified of being overrun by Tecumseh's men. It was the first major US military surrender, and it happened on their own soil, but the alliance came at a cost. When Tecumseh was killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, his confederacy fractured. By the end of the war, the same indigenous nations that had saved Canada were left out of the peace deal entirely. Both Britain and America abandoned them. It was the first great betrayal of North American unity, a promise broken before a country ever existed. Then came August 1814, the night the empire struck back. The British had had enough. After years of fighting a defensive war, they went on the offensive. British forces landed in Maryland and marched straight toward Washington, D.C. When General Robert Ross reached the Capitol, he didn't negotiate. He torched it. The White House, the Capitol, and the Library of Congress went up in flames. For a few terrifying days, the United States was leaderless. The story everyone remembers is Dolly Madison running out with George Washington's portrait under her arm. What they forget is how close the country came to collapse. Ross could have held the city, maybe even toppled the government, but he didn't. He ordered his troops out after proving a point. The empire could burn its former colony anytime it wanted. If the British had launched a second offensive from Halifax, the US might not have survived. The revolution could have been undone in less than 40 years. The only thing that saved Washington was British exhaustion. After fighting France for over 2 decades, London didn't want another endless war. The troops withdrew, leaving a blackened capital but a still living republic. The message was clear: Britain wasn't invincible anymore, but neither was the United States. While America licked its wounds, something else was happening north of the border. Out of the fires of invasion, a new sense of identity was forming. Canada, which didn't even exist as a country yet, was being born on battlefields like Queenston Heights, 1812, and Lundy's Lane, 1814. These weren't professional armies, they were farmers, shopkeepers, and loyalists fighting to keep their homes. Their rallying cry was loyalty to the crown, but what grew from that was something more powerful: the idea of a nation that refused to be conquered. At Queenston Heights, Major General Isaac Brock became the face face of that resistance. He died leading a counterattack against invading US troops, and his death turned him into a martyr for what would become Canadian defiance. His statue still overlooks the Niagara River as a reminder of the day locals stopped an empire. What's chilling is that Washington had already drafted plans for what came next. If Canada fell, it would be split into 5 new American territories, governed under the US flag. Those maps still exist, tucked away in archives in Washington. They were ready for a continental government long before the Civil War ever tested the idea of unity again. But the British weren't just defending, they were thinking ahead. Private papers from British strategists reveal discussions that never made it into official history. Some argued that if the US could invade Canada, then the Empire could reverse the move, retake the 13 colonies using Canada as a base. It never happened, but the thought alone shows how fragile the entire continent's balance of power really was. So when the war ended in 1815, neither side had won, but both had changed forever. The US failed to conquer Canada, and Canada discovered what it meant to fight as a people. Out of that chaos, the border we know today was born. A thin line that nearly vanished 2 centuries ago, when North America almost became one nation. When the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th, 1814, diplomats called it a peace agreement, but buried drafts told a very different story. Before the ink dried, early proposals outlined something revolutionary: a continental trade and defense pact that would have bound Britain, the United States, and British North America into a single cooperative bloc. It wasn't just about ending war, it was about preventing future ones by tying economies and militaries together. One flag would not rule them all, but 3 would stand side by side. Shared ports, shared armies, and one currency between London, Washington, and Quebec. The Americans at the table didn't reject it immediately, until nationalists back home found out. To them, any pact with Britain smelled like a second colonization. Southern congressmen, especially from Virginia and South Carolina, warned it would be the second coming of empire. They wanted total independence, not a continental alliance that felt like a leash. The British negotiators, led by Admiral Lord Gambier and Henry Goulburn, quietly archived the Joint Protection Proposal after Washington's refusal. It was never ratified, never spoken of again in official records. Centuries later, economic historians would rediscover the documents and call it the missed NAFTA of the 19th century. A trade system connecting the Atlantic ports of Boston, Halifax, and Liverpool would have turned the North Atlantic into one economic unit 100 years before globalization. The irony is brutal. The same agreement that might have united the continent was killed, not by war, but by pride. But America didn't give up on continental control. It just changed tactics. Between 1866 and 1871, the US made a secret push to buy Canada outright. It sounds absurd, but declassified notes from the State Department's post-Civil War files confirmed the proposal: $125 million in gold, which equals about $3.2 billion today. The plan came straight from Washington's inner circle, authorized under President Andrew Johnson and pushed by expansionist senators who wanted to secure the northern border before Europe regained its grip. Across the Atlantic, Britain's diplomats debated it seriously. In a letter from Lord Clarendon, Britain's foreign secretary, he admitted that Canada is expensive sentiment, meaning it cost far more to defend than it was worth economically. The empire was broke after years of maintaining garrisons from India to the Caribbean. Selling off the northern colony was tempting. The sale fell apart when Sir John A. Macdonald, then forming Canada's government, got wind of the plan in 1866. Rather than risk annexation, he turned panic into politics. Within a year, he united Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick under the British North America Act of 1867, creating the Dominion of Canada. It was an act of survival disguised as nationalism. The documents from the US offer, labeled Proposal of Union Northern Dominion, are still sealed in the US National Archives. Historians who've reviewed the catalog entries confirm their existence but not their contents. Whatever was in those pages was significant enough to stay locked for more than 150 years. By then, the United States had turned its sights south, not north. The Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, became the real Continental War, the one that should have unified the hemisphere but tore it further apart. The US under President James K. Polk invaded Mexico, capturing Mexico City in September 1847 and seizing half of the nation's territory through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The land that became California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada was born from that victory. America's expansion looked unstoppable, but its ambitions terrified the rest of the continent. Britain saw it as a warning shot. If the US could dismember Mexico, it could swallow Canada next. London immediately began drafting a roadmap for Canadian autonomy to create a buffer, the first steps toward full independence decades later. Canada's creation in 1867 was no coincidence. It was a reaction to American expansionism, a diplomatic defense line. The irony was staggering. Less than a decade after nearly being sold to the United States, Canada was quietly preparing to invade it. It remains the only time in history that Canada developed an official plan to strike the US mainland. The idea of peaceful coexistence, the myth of the world's friendliest border, was still decades away. In the 1860s, the border was a powder keg, one spark away from turning the entire continent into a war zone again. These were the forgotten chapters: a lost treaty, a near sale, a continental war, and a reverse invasion. Moments when North America nearly fused into one power, then tore itself apart again.